Mount Vesuvius. Its green slopes lie placidly in the sunshine. It's hard to imagine this peaceful mountain as the site of a devastating catastrophe.
2,000 years ago, the Bay of Naples was a gathering place for Roman high society. Emperor Tiberius even moved his court to the island of Capri. Lining the bay were luxurious villas belonging to Roman nobles, set among vineyards and olive trees. Between them lay the pretty towns that were vacation spots and commercial centres in the region. To the south of Vesuvius, Pompeii on the river Sarno. West of the mountain, Herculaneum, a fishing village that had become a resort for wealthy Romans.
The world is at peace. Most people here make a decent living. Then, on August the 24th of the year 79 AD, all hell breaks loose. A sudden column of smoke rises over Vesuvius. Few people even knew the mountain was volcanic, and now it spews death and destruction. A relentless hail of glowing rock drums down on Pompeii. Roofs cave in, entire houses are buried. Whoever doesn't escape early on has no chance of surviving. Avalanches of glowing gases sweep down the slopes, eradicating all life.
One of the greatest natural disasters of antiquity, the eruption of Vesuvius brought an agonizing death to thousands of people. But for us, 2 millennia later, it left a treasure trove. In the streets of Pompeii and Herculaneum, the past comes to life.
The Forum in the year 79 AD. This is the lively heart of the town. Here are the imposing public buildings. And here is the market, where vendors and shoppers haggle and gossip beneath the stately columns. From the patrician attending the debate at the city council to the slave doing the household shopping. From the market vendor tending her stand to the housewife on her way to the baths. All Pompeians cross paths at the Forum.
We can imagine life in Roman times, yet there is still so much that we do not know. The Forum is known to have been full of statues, but archaeologists have found virtually none of them. After the disaster, Emperor Titus sent a commission to Pompeii to coordinate relief efforts. Did its members dig up the valuable statues? Or was it the work of later treasure hunters? No one knows. This spot was once the site of a temple. Was it the temple of Venus? She was the patron goddess of Pompeii, so she must have had a large shrine. And this one, near the Forum, is probably the best candidate. But again, archaeologists are not certain.
One of the things that fascinates me about Pompeii is how difficult it is for us now, at a gap of 2,000 years, to understand how space was used. It could be public space, big buildings off the Forum, and it can be the rooms in a private house. It's because life 2,000 years ago, in a very different culture and society, is at an enormous distance from ourselves.
Nonetheless, the ruins tell us plenty of stories about life in the city.
The Forum is a pedestrian zone. The streets leading to it are blocked off to traffic. The ox-drawn wagons and handcarts rattling through the neighbouring streets have left deep ruts over the course of the centuries. Pompeii is an ancient city. The town is full of pulsating life. Vendors offer their wares as the craftsmen ply their trades and horses and heavily laden donkeys push their way through the crowds. Stores and workshops line the streets. The facades are colourful with painted commercial signs, images of the gods and graffiti.
That was one of the biggest surprises for the archaeologists who excavated here in the 18th century. No one had realised how colourful the ancient world was. The National Archaeological Museum of Naples houses a statue of Marcus Holconius Rufus, a local bigwig in Pompeii during the reign of Emperor Augustus. The statue once stood here, erected by the city council in front of the biggest public baths. Holconius Rufus is wearing military dress, and archaeologists have found the remnants of paint on the garments. The whole figure was brightly coloured. He stands in imperial pose, although he was just the mayor of a small town. But nothing was more important in Roman society than status. Prestige was everything.
That goes for the architecture too. From the outside, the houses are often forbidding with their high, nearly windowless walls. But their appearance is deceiving. Even wealthy homes are not hidden away behind barriers and security fences. On the contrary, the houses are open to all. The front doors are spectacular, designed to impress, and often they stay open all day long. But here there is a guard. Cave canem, beware of the dog.
This was not necessarily an empty threat. Many people in Pompeii had dogs, and some of the animals did not survive the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The view from the entrance across the atrium is carefully planned.
It was important, especially for upper-class Romans, to let the public into their private rooms, or part of them at least, because they wanted to show off what they had. That is why the atrium and the tablinum, the reception area, and the peristyle, the garden, are all arranged along a line of sight. So when the door was open, one look along the visual axis was enough to recognize the wealth that was present in the house.
That wealth was also demonstrated by the decorations of the houses. The rooms were painted from floor to ceiling with panels steeped in colour. Many of these frescoes are on display today in the Archaeological Museum in Naples. Over time, the decorations became more and more fanciful. However, just like today, some people had little sympathy with modern art. The architect Vitruvius, who wrote the only surviving Roman treatise on architecture, complained about it.
How can a reed support a roof, or a candelabra carry the ornaments of a pediment? How can a thin, delicate branch hold a seated figure, or roots and stalks produce blossoms here and half-length figures there?
The conclusion for Vitruvius is clear.
Pictures which are unlike reality should not be approved, and even if they are artistically fine, this is no reason why they should be judged to be correct, if they violate common sense.
But above all, Vitruvius's work contains specific instructions on building Roman houses. The atrium is the centre of the house. It provides light and water. In the impluvium, rainwater collects from the roof. The most expensive homes in Pompeii had running water. The others captured rainwater so that residents didn't have to keep dashing off to the nearest public fountain. Visitors were welcome in the atriums of elegant homes. They were grand reception areas open to the public. But again, matters are not as clear-cut as we'd like them to be.
We really expect rooms to have functions. This room is a dining room. This room is a bedroom. This room is a library, maybe. I've come to think that you have to operate with much looser categories with antiquity, that these are the reception rooms, but let's not be too fussy about it. And of course, at some times, they may have used this great reception room for weaving, and therefore you find a lot of loom weights in it.
Some households use the atrium as a storeroom, and archaeologists have often found them furnished with tables or cupboards. The walls of this room still show the traces of shelves. The holes are where the shelf supports were embedded in the wall. It is a cubiculum, one of the small rooms off the atrium that were also used as bedchambers. There are more rooms on the upper floor. Most of the houses in Pompeii were two-storey buildings, and sometimes a flight of stairs led up directly from the atrium. Today, the rooms seem empty and desolate. But when they were first excavated, they were full of objects. Most of the artefacts are now in the museum in Naples. By today's standards, the kitchen is very small. Here's a surprise. The toilet was in the kitchen, so it could be used to dispose of kitchen waste as well. There was no bathroom. In the Roman world, bathing was a public pleasure. How many people might have lived here? The Roman familia included not only parents and children, but slaves as well.
The head of the family, the paterfamilias, has absolute power over the household. His wife and even his grown children remain dependents throughout his lifetime. The room most closely associated with the paterfamilias is the tablinum, the reception room opposite the entrance. It is splendidly furnished. The floor is adorned with a costly mosaic.
An author is surrounded by his troupe of actors. Archaeologists named the building the House of the Tragic Poet after this image. Like the frescoes, mosaics were art forms that the Romans adopted from Greek culture. This famous mosaic was also discovered in a tablinum. Visitors to the room found themselves face to face with the greatest general of all time, Alexander the Great. The dramatic scene shows him in the Battle of Issus, defeating the Persian king Darius, a powerful rival in the ancient world. Apparently, the owner here in Pompeii hoped to bask in the glory of the mighty Alexander. The tablinum was also the room where the paterfamilias received poorer citizens who came to ask for assistance. He did not view them as pesky beggars.
You can only tell that a rich person is powerful because lots of people cluster around them and ask for support. Even in the act of supporting your dependents, you are translating your wealth into power. And so, in some sense, the ancient rich can't live without the poor. The modern rich want to escape from them.
Behind the tablinum, the garden. Some houses had only a tiny one, but it did provide light, air, and a bit of green.
And you don't have to settle for just a few plants. Those who can afford it open up the walls with pictures, turning even the tiniest garden into an exotic paradise with wild animals or gods. The owner of this house probably didn't have the money to pay for a great artist. His pretentious Venus looks a bit clumsy. But the overall effect is delightful. The picture takes us to the sea, where the goddess reclines on her half shell. It's a window on a faraway place, flanked by luscious gardens, featuring a statue of Mars, the god of war, and a fountain. But sometimes the gardens themselves have impressive dimensions. This house belongs to one Octavius Quarto. At least his seal ring is later found at the entrance. His property in the heart of the city is designed like a country manor. The shady trees are reflected in water channels full of shimmering fish. On warm summer evenings, the owner receives his dinner guests in the idyllic outdoor summer triclinium, where the diners recline around a fountain. The more educated visitors may be amused by this ironic touch. Above the water is a picture of Narcissus, the demigod who fell in love with his own mirror image in the water. Another room opening up to the garden is the ekkas, a parlour for receiving guests, which the owner has also decorated with paintings and mosaics. Those who have no triclinium can hold banquets here. Dinner invitations are important social occasions, where rich families demonstrate their wealth to one another. Frivolous touches are very popular, like these bronze figures who probably held out snacks for the guests on their trays.
Banquets were not necessarily orgies. The evening entertainments could vary greatly, depending on the temperament of the host.
You might have philosophical conversations. Some did, or you could have a speaker who would recite Homeric verses, even an entire book of Homer. Some did that. But then there were others who would hire a few female dancers and flutists and take advantage of their talents in every conceivable way.
Here, people are drinking and partying. One of the women seems to have had too much wine. Fortunately, a helpful slave is at her side. The pictures were found in a large room at the back of the bakery. The baker probably rented it out to Pompeians who lacked the space to hold a banquet. Usually, these kinds of parties were reserved for the rich.
One of the largest houses belongs to the Pompeii, who were among the richest families of the entire empire. A daughter of the family was the second wife of Emperor Nero. She became a star in the capital, famed for her beauty, notorious for her ambition.
Here, excavators discovered a set of silverware, carefully packed in a wooden chest, along with the family jewels. These exquisite furnishings belonged to wealthy households. Ordinary people made do with tableware made of bronze, clay or cheap glass. Obviously, not all Pompeians lived in luxury. Many of the craftsmen and merchants were former slaves. They often lived behind or over their workplaces, in small rooms with no space for a kitchen. Nowadays, rich people eat in restaurants, while the poor cook at home. In the Roman Empire, it was the other way round. Throughout the town, we find the typical cook shops where ordinary people went to eat. Many of them were also grocery stores. The groceries were kept in the clay vessels, and hot dishes could be prepared right there at the counter. Recent research shows that even the less wealthy people of Pompeii and Herculaneum ate well. Professor Andrew Wallace Hadrill found evidence for this in a sewer, of all places.
Now that sewer is under a block of houses which are shops and flats. There's no way that the people lived there were the elite, the rich people of the town. And yet the diet is wonderfully rich and varied, and there's fish and nuts and meat and fruit and eggs and chickens and sea urchins, all sorts of stuff. And it tells you that the ordinary people lived in a way that if all the evidence you had was the contents of what they'd be eating, you'd say, oh, these must be rich people.
It is also impossible to distinguish rich and poor by the section of town they lived in. Pompeii had neither affluent areas nor slums. Residents from all social classes lived side by side, like here in the block of houses known as the Insula Ariana Poliana. The inside of the block is taken up by a luxurious dwelling known as the House of Pansa. Around it were simpler apartments, smaller atrium houses of the type called domus, rather like today's single-family homes. On the exterior, facing the main street, were shops, some of them with mezzanines. On the side alleys were tiny shops, generally with just 1 or 2 rooms. We don't know what goods they sold, but some of the vendors in these stalls must have slept behind their counters. The upper floors of the houses often contained rental apartments. Few of them have been preserved. Generally, we can only see the entranceways. They are found throughout the city. In some cases, the stairways are still standing.
Rented apartments are not necessarily living quarters of poor residents, as advertisements on the facades tell us.
In the property of Julia, daughter of Spurius Felix, to let. Elegant bathing facilities for respectable people. Shops with annexed apartments upstairs. And independent apartments on the first floor for a period of 5 years from this coming August to August the 1st of the 6th year.
Judging from Pompeii alone, it would be easy to imagine that the rich people lived on the ground floors and that their slaves lived in attics upstairs. In Herculaneum, you see that the decoration on the upper floors is also very fine, that there isn't a distinction in levels between the slave and owner, that people lived in flats on upper floors that could be really rather smart.
But there was a distinction. Physical labour was mainly carried out by slaves. Nearly half the inhabitants of Pompeii are believed to have been slaves. They were generally freed at around 30 years of age, and many of them went on to start up businesses as tradesmen or shopkeepers. Here in the Macellum, slaves would have purchased from slaves, some taking care of their owners' households, others selling the fruits of their own labour. This largest market in the city mainly dealt in meat and fish, as shown by the many bones found in excavations. More than 50 professions have been identified in Pompeii, ranging from weavers to barbers, from painters to public pigkeeper.
Among the most important tradesmen are the bakers. Pompeii has more than 3 dozen bakeries. This is where the flour is freshly ground. The mills are turned by donkeys or mules. A side room off the bakery is the store for these four-legged Pompeians. The heart of the bakery is the oven. More than 1,000 years later, this kind of wood-burning oven will produce the first pizza. Wool making is a flourishing branch of the economy. This laundry is located directly on the main street. Here the raw wool gets washed, as does completed clothing. The detergent used for washing the wool is urine. Its high levels of ammonia are good for dissolving fat. Slaves stand up to their ankles in the urine brine, walking the wool with their feet. That is followed by several rinses until the fabrics can be hung out on the roof to dry. The laundry belongs to a certain Stephanus. On the facade, he is advertising himself for the upcoming elections. This store sign made of marble shows activities in a metal workshop. First, the raw material has to be weighed, even if the small son of the owner is getting in the way. On an anvil, the smith is making bowls, kettles and pails. They wouldn't sell without some adornment. That's being taken care of by a talented artisan. This workshop also has a dog. He enjoys an overview of the workshop from a ledge on the wall. On a shelf above the dog, the completed wares are on offer.
A similar shelf was found in this wine store in Herculaneum. It was preserved, along with a large part of the shop's contents. Here, too, the owner may have slept over his shop. The remains of a bed can still be seen.
Herculaneum, the small town neighbouring Pompeii, is located directly on the sea. It boasts many luxurious houses with superb views. On the outskirts of Herculaneum are some of the most sumptuous estates of the Roman world, including the giant palace built by Julius Caesar's father-in-law, Calpurnius Caesoninus Piso. Innumerable statues bear witness to the immense wealth of the Romans who spent their summers here.
Herculaneum was also destroyed by the eruption in the year 79, but here the buildings were not smashed by the volcanic rock. Instead, Herculaneum was engulfed by pyroclastic flows, glowing avalanches of hot gases and fine ash. Wood and other organic materials were instantly charred and preserved under more than 20 metres of volcanic ash. That has enabled archaeologists to unearth many remnants of life in antiquity. For example, the fishermen's utensils, including fish hooks, a rolled-up rope, and an almost intact fishing boat, 9 metres long and over 2 metres wide. It was beached directly in front of the town. Fish was the basis of the popular condiment called garum, a sauce made of crushed and fermented fish intestines. This may not sound very appetizing to us today, but garum from Pompeii was beloved throughout the Roman world. And the Romans were certainly discerning gourmets.
Romans don't just drink local wine, they import stuff all the time. You can see that in Pompeii. You can see that the Pompeians are importing wine from Crete and from all over the Mediterranean. They're importing dates from Palestine was an example of one of the containers we found in our excavations. But they also export, and Pompeian wine had a reputation and was drunk in other places in Italy.
Pompeii wasn't only known for wine and fish sauce, even its onions had a reputation that reached all the way to the capital. Farming was the most important basis for Pompeian wealth. Hundreds of farms and country estates were dotted around the region. One of them lay right outside the city gates. As in many other cases, it was both a luxurious country manor and a functioning vineyard. Pliny the Younger, in one of his many famous letters, extols the advantages of a country villa for wealthy city dwellers.
They can clear their heads and refresh their eyes as they stroll around their grounds and tread their single path, getting to know each of their precious vines and counting every fruit tree.
Back to nature, a counterbalance to the hustle and bustle of life in Rome, and a profitable business in its own right.
In one tract of the house is the wine press, used to extract the last drop of juice from the crushed grapes. It flows directly into the next room, to be stored in giant amphorae. Wooden barrels are only used by winemakers in Gaul. On the other side of the peristyle is the private tract, where the rich owner leads a life of luxury.
Perhaps this is what he looked like. At any rate, someone left this caricature on the wall for posterity. The atrium was an impressive size. Wooden doors shut it off from the interior courtyard. The windows had wooden shutters too. The tablinum is decorated with exquisite paintings. The owner was clearly a fan of Egyptian design. The windows may have had glass panes. That was not unusual in the homes of the wealthy. Pliny, for example, lovingly described his own villa.
The colonnaded walk makes an excellent place of refuge in bad weather, for it is protected by glazed windows and by a projection of the roof.
A few glass panes that survived the millennia are now on display in the Naples Museum.
The road back into town is lined with graves, like all roads outside the gates of Roman cities, for it is forbidden by law to bury the dead within the town walls. Here too, the upper classes use the opportunity to show off. Many of the larger monuments are graves honouring respected citizens, like this one for Calventius Quietus. Within its walls are the unadorned graves of his family members. Roman social structures persist after death. So, as in their lifetime, the rich are surrounded by a cluster of dependents.
What's remarkable about this grave is that although the monument looks like that of a noble landowner, his name suggests that Calventius Quietus must have once been a slave. Freed slaves had nearly full citizenship rights. Rome was a capitalist society, and those who were successful could climb the social ladder. A little further on, the grave of Aulus Umbricius Scaurus. His family became fabulously wealthy from manufacturing garum, the fish-based condiment. He too must have been a descendant of former slaves, yet the inscription proudly states that he made it to the highest office in the city of Pompeii. He was a duumvir. The duumviri jure decundo, literally the two men with the authority to pronounce justice, were the two chief magistrates of the community. And this is where they may have pronounced the law, on the podium in the basilica. The great hall on the Forum was the venue of court cases, and it was where people came together to discuss business and politics.
New duumviri are elected each year. As with most important posts, two office holders exercise their authority jointly, both supporting and monitoring each other. The duumviri are at the peak of this status-conscious society. They enjoy huge prestige. They represent Pompeii in Rome, before the officials and even the emperor.
The electioneering slogans preserved on walls throughout the city have been a boon to historians. Every year, new names were written over the old ones. By following the layers of paint, it is often possible to say who was who in Pompeian politics in a given year. However, it's unclear how extensive these election campaigns actually were.
Pompeii is a small town. Everybody knows everybody. And voters tend to elect the ones they always do, namely the sons of established, influential families, plus a handful of nouveaux riches, who traditional society may scorn, but who can't be excluded.
After all, they fulfilled the main requirements for public office, that candidates be adult males who are free-born from a respectable family. And that means they had to be rich. Public posts were generally not lucrative. On the contrary.
The upper class was expected to and did see it as a duty to show generosity toward the common people and toward the city. Much of what we would see today as the responsibility of the municipal administration was financed by wealthy citizens. You could say it was like the American approach.
One of the important duties of the duumviri was to finance public buildings. For example, the Odeon, a small musical theatre which once had a wooden roof and excellent acoustics, was commissioned by Caius Quinctius Valgus and Marcus Porcius, for which they are lauded on the inscription right next to the architect. Just like today, some projects spiralled out of control. Our old acquaintance, Marcus Holconius Rufus, who was Doumvir 5 times, had the Temple of Apollo enlarged and had to pay a small fortune in damages to a neighbour who sued because the larger temple blocked the sunlight.
The office of the Doumviri is directly in the Forum. Next to it is the Curia, or Council Hall. In the Council of the City Fathers, the Ordo Decurionum, the 100 most important men of the town, make decisions on the budget and taxes. But the daily business is in the hands of a public slave. Another indication of the high status that slaves can achieve in society.
However, although freedmen, that is, former slaves, had the right to vote, only free-born Romans could be elected to public office. That explains this inscription on the Temple of Isis. Numerius Porpidius Celsinus, it reads, renovated the temple and was accepted out of gratitude into the town council, aged 6 years old. Here an ambitious freedman was ensuring his son's entry into elite society.
Next to the Curia, the office belonging to the 2 aediles. They are also elected every year. They are in charge of public order. They maintain the city streets, act as police chiefs and oversee the markets. Here at the Forum, customers can check for themselves whether the vendors are abiding by the law. The weights and measures are standardized.
All public posts were restricted to men. No woman was allowed to run for office. Women had few rights. They were entirely subordinate to their paterfamilias. But as usual, real life was often different from theory. Women ran shops and taverns, some of them owned entire blocks of houses, and although they themselves could not vote, women advertised on posters for the candidates of their choice. A tomb just outside the Herculaneum Gate invites passers-by to stop for a rest and read the inscription. Surprisingly, the imposing monument commemorates a woman named Mammia. And the largest of all tombs discovered at Pompeii is dedicated to a female named Eumacia. This influential woman commissioned one of the largest buildings at the Forum. It was the guild house of the fullers, the tradesmen who laundered clothes and washed wool, and they honoured their patroness with a statue. Eumacia held the only position of power that was available to women. She was a priestess.
The state religion is what holds Roman society together. The ceremonies performed on countless holidays are public occasions. They often begin with splendid processions. Here, carpenters are carrying a shrine through the city with a model of their work. On the far left is the characteristic shield of Minerva. She is the patron goddess of craftsmen. The procession is heading to her temple in the middle of the Forum.
The town's main temple was dedicated to the 3 mightiest gods: Jupiter, the father of the gods, his wife Juno, protector of birth and marriage, and Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. She was the patron of craftsmen as well as poets and teachers. Statues of the gods once stood in niches on the back wall of the temple. Around them lay offerings with which the Pompeian worshippers hoped to gain the favour of the gods. Perhaps the carpenter's model ended up here.
In Roman religion, the ceremonies do not take place in the temples, but at the altar in front. The most important ritual being animal sacrifices. The priest is wearing a white toga, which he has pulled on over his head. From the right, bare-chested slaves bring the sacrificial bull to the altar. The innards of the slain animal are used by specially trained priests to tell the future. A portion of the meat is burned at the altar, and the rest is distributed among the population, which strengthens their sense of community. Care is taken to carry out all rituals in the traditional manner. Any change would shake society to its foundations.
The imperial cult was also part of the state religion. Was the emperor a god? That seemed plausible to Romans. In their mythology, the boundary between the human world and the world of the gods was a flowing one. Many a hero became immortal, like Hercules, here being led into Olympus by Juno and Minerva. And surely the emperor with his great power was literally superhuman. Ultimately, the imperial cult also served to unify the people, to make them identify with their state.
Man wünscht sich selbst alles Gute.
In honouring the emperor, one was honouring oneself. Wishing the best for the emperor, as the highest man in this state, was wishing oneself all the best. I can say I have to wish the best for the man at the top, so that he can best govern his empire, which is also my empire. So all those wishes, we wish the emperor all the best, develop into a kind of personality cult.
This is where the statue of Augustus once stood, in the College of the Augustales in Herculaneum. The members of this order were in charge of the imperial cult of Augustus, and many of them were freedmen. As former slaves were barred from holding political posts, the cult provided a prestigious way of giving them a role in civic life.
But religion is not confined to the big public temples. Every house has a small altar, where families make sacrifices to the household gods. The deities are present in the shape of small statues. The penates are the patron gods of the house, and the lares are the ancestors' spirits. Worshippers ask them to pour wealth over the family from their cornucopia. For that they receive offerings of eggs, fruit or pine cones, all fertility symbols. And at every meal a portion is thrown into the hearth for them. Even more important is the genius of the paterfamilias, that is, his divine spirit, often represented by a snake. The official state religion has few answers for some big questions, such as the fear of death. Many people seek help from foreign gods. A highly popular cult is that of the mysterious Isis. In Egyptian religion, she is the wife of Osiris, the god of the dead. After Osiris is murdered and dismembered by his brother, Isis collects the pieces of his corpse, recalls him to life, and conceives with him the god Horus. For that reason, she is revered as the conqueror of death by many Romans as well. Not a problem for the state. As long as people do not contradict the official religion, they may worship whatever gods they like. In fact, the Roman pantheon often absorbs the deities of conquered peoples. That encourages their loyalty to Rome. Besides, you never know. Insulting the wrong god could have nasty results. Here too we see the altar in front of the temple. The small shed contains steps leading underground. Ritual cleansings take place beneath the altar.
These kinds of private religious ceremonies are called mystery cults. They harbour secrets that are only revealed to believers. Consequently, the Isis temple was not accessible to the public. Only a single door leads into the sanctum. The famous frescoes in the Villa dei Misteri also seem to be related to a mystery cult. So far, no one is entirely sure what they depict. But a central role is played by the god Bacchus, known as Dionysus in Greek.
First, women appear to be preparing for a ceremony. One of them is probably a priestess. Next come members of Dionysus's traditional retinue, a satyr, a demon with a lyre, and 2 goat herds. The central scene shows Dionysus himself in the arms of his bride Ariadne. He is the deity of rough, wild nature, of intoxication and ecstasy, of fertility and sex. That is what the young woman in this picture is preparing herself for. She is combing her tresses into a traditional wedding hairstyle. Are these frescoes about the initiation of a bride? Romans view weddings as private events. Marriages are not carried out by public priests. Usually the bride is brought in a solemn procession to the home of her husband. There is a banquet, and as long as the couple lives together, they are married.
On the whole, the Romans had an uninhibited attitude towards sexuality, viewing it as a part of daily life, as demonstrated by countless pictures, sculptures, and pieces of graffiti. The men's world of Pompeii placed a high value on virility and potency. Phalluses are everywhere, even in the streets. The phallus is a fertility symbol, and as an amulet, it wards off the evil eye and grants wealth. The archaeologists who excavated here in the 19th century were shocked to find phalluses everywhere. Was Pompeii full of brothels? Indeed, there are lots of advertisements by prostitutes who offered their services in taverns or the public baths. But are erotic paintings in some back rooms necessarily a sign of a certain type of establishment? In fact, there's only a single house that must have been a brothel. The drawings over the doors are unambiguous. Perhaps they're catalogues of what's on offer. In one corner is a toilet, and then 5 cabins downstairs, and as many again on the upper floor. They're not very romantic, even if we imagine pillows and soft furs on the couches. The prostitutes were slaves from foreign countries. Their services were quick and cheap. Having sex cost about as much as a good flask of wine. Once again, the rich satisfied their needs at home, where sexual relationships with slaves were seen as perfectly normal, while the less wealthy came here. But the customers did get satisfaction. as attested to by hundreds of pieces of graffiti on the walls.
A major public meeting place is the baths. In the Roman Empire, it's usual for people to hold appointments in the nude. A visitor to the bath leaves his things in the niche in the wall, though preferably not his valuables. They're likely to be stolen, as even Roman writers report. The rooms of the baths are places of splendour, palaces for the people. Everyone comes here to relax, from slaves to senators. Even the emperor will occasionally put in an appearance in the public baths of Rome.
The suburban baths of Herculaneum are among the best preserved ones in the world, and they also demonstrate the terrible power of the volcano. Here too, wooden doors were conserved by the ash. The central furnace not only warmed the water, but heated the floor. This ingenious system was invented here in Campania, and from here it spread through the entire empire. It features double floors and walls with ducts through which hot air circulated. In the evenings after work, the people of Pompeii headed to the taverns. A publican had some everyday vignettes drawn on the wall, like a comic strip. The server brings an eagerly awaited glass of wine.
Here.
Calls the guest on the left.
No, that's mine.
Shouts the one on the right. The server doesn't seem to care, one way or the other.
Whoever wants it, take it.
Next, we see a somewhat tentative love scene. Or perhaps the end of it.
With Myrtalis, I don't want to...
says the man, but we will never know exactly what he doesn't want to do with Myrtalis. One of the most popular vices in Pompeii was gambling, but even over dice there were differences of opinion.
I won. That's not a 3, it's a 2.
The final picture once showed the two men coming to blows over the dice. Only the inscriptions had been preserved, with a couple of vulgar insults. But the tavern keeper has the last word.
If you want to fight, get out.
The passion for games was a bond between rich and poor. Dice have been discovered in cheap taverns, as well as in the wealthiest homes.
Wine and dice are one way to spend an evening. But for a real treat, Pompeians go to the theatre. Pompeii had a theatre long before the capital Rome did. Our old friend Marcus Hulconius Rufus had the old building restored and enlarged until it accommodated 5,000 people, nearly half the population of Pompeii. They come to see, they come to be seen, wrote Ovid, the great poet. He meant not only the women in their fashionable robes, but also the elegant men. Poorer citizens, women and slaves, sit in the upper rows of seats. From here they can cheer the actors on stage and their rich patrons. The patricians have places reserved for them in the lower rows. The broad entryways next to the stage let them play to the gallery. There's a separate entrance for the common people, right next to the one for the elite, but narrower and steeper.
The people of Pompeii must have been obsessed with the theatre. Everywhere in the town we find images of the typical masks. At the same time, the actor's profession was considered dishonourable. It put them on the same level as prostitutes, but also as the greatest stars of the entertainment business, the gladiators.
Their stage is the amphitheatre. Here too the common people have to climb to the upper levels, while wealthy patrons have their own entrances to the seats below. In the year 79 AD, most of the seats are still made of wood, and are only gradually being replaced with stone benches. The fighters make their triumphal entrance through the wide portals. The spectacle begins with a hunting scene featuring wolves and bears.
Most likely, lions never made it to Pompeii. To see them, one had to travel to Rome. And even the gladiator fights were not as bloody as we imagine them today. The fighters were not automatically doomed to die.
Das Publikum entschied letztlich.
Ultimately, the audience decided the fate of a gladiator who had lost.
Natürlich kam es vor, dass jemand im Kampf tödlich verletzt wurde.
Of course it happened that someone would be fatally wounded in the fight. But if he lost, that is, had to give up, but had fought bravely and put on a good show, then the audience would usually let him go.
Ihn entlassen.
The victors often became celebrities, and not only to the lower classes. Even here in the theatre entrance for the wealthy, a fan immortalised his idols for posterity.
The fans keep statistics on their heroes' victories and celebrate them, like here in the peristyle of the House of the Say. Women are among the enthusiasts too. The champions may be despised, rough, violent, but they are real men. Most of them are slaves or condemned criminals. However, such is their fame that again and again there are also free-born Romans who become gladiators, making them temporary slaves. The rest of the time he lives and trains here in the gladiators' barracks as a member of a troop belonging to a master or lanista.
These troops were also known as familia, and often the opponents in the arena were actually friends, another reason why they were generally not inclined to kill each other. And their owners didn't like to see them die either.
Die Gladiatoren waren in der Regel.
In general, the gladiators had outstanding training. In other words, a great deal had been invested in preparing them. So if a gladiator died, it was a considerable financial loss.
Again, it was the rich people who sponsored gladiator events. The spectacles were very costly, but good for the patron's image. The more generous sponsors even paid for awnings over the arena, a move which made them very popular.
There is space for 22,000 people in the amphitheatre, considerably more than the number of residents of Pompeii. It is an entertainment centre, attracting audiences from farms and neighbouring towns in the entire region. As can be expected among neighbours, there are long-standing rivalries, and sometimes they explode, as they did in 59 AD.
This fresco tells the story. Many spectators had come from the neighbouring town of Nuceria to see a gladiator show. In the foreground, all is normal. Street vendors offer snacks and souvenirs for sale. Women stroll under the trees. But inside the arena, it's not only the gladiators who are fighting. This is how the famous historian Tacitus described the fray between hooligans from Pompeii and Nuceria.
With the rough wit typical of country towns, they first hurled abuse at each other, then stones were thrown, finally they drew their weapons. The people of Pompeii, where the spectacle was being held, were too strong for their adversaries.
The clashes continued outside the amphitheatre. People were killed and wounded, most of them Nucerians. The incident sent waves of outrage as far away as Rome and set the machinery of government into action. The emperor ordered the Senate to investigate. The Senate directed an inquiry before the consuls. The consuls sent a report back to the Senate, who finally gave a verdict. The ringleaders of the unrest were banished, and Pompeii was prohibited from holding games in the amphitheatre for 10 years.
What a catastrophe, for the fans as well as the sponsors. Luckily, there are alternatives, such as occasionally staging the events here in the Forum, which is not subject to the ban.
But all that came to a terrible end in the year 79. There were forewarnings of the calamity, according to Pliny the Younger.
For many days before there were earthquakes, but hardly anyone was particularly alarmed because they are frequent in Campania.
Then, on August the 24th, a cloud of ash rose suddenly from Vesuvius. Pliny compared its appearance to that of an umbrella pine tree. At 12 noon, the disaster struck. A hail of pumice stone drummed down on the town. Panicked residents tied pillows to their heads. At this point, it would have been possible to flee, but many hesitated. Who would protect their houses from plunderers?
Now the roofs are starting to collapse under the impact. The earthquakes increase in intensity. Now most of the Pompeians do try to escape, but not all of them make it out of the city in time. In Herculaneum, the streets are empty. At 4 o'clock in the morning, a glowing avalanche races down the mountainside. 5 more follow. More than 300 people seek shelter in the vaulted boathouses near the beach. A few gasps, and they die a quick death in the hellish heat. The fugitives in one garden in Pompeii also don't have a chance. This father takes a last look at his wife and child. They are already dead.
After less than 24 hours, 2 cities and numerous country estates had simply disappeared.
Will future generations believe, when crops spring up once more and this wasteland grows green again, that cities and people are buried below and that ancestral fields vanished like this?
The poet Publius Papinius Statius wrote that several years after the eruption. It took nearly 1700 years for them to be rediscovered. The houses and temples, the pictures, mosaics, statues, and bits and pieces. And above all, the people of Pompeii and Herculaneum, who, in death, have told us so much about their lives.